Hey everyone, welcome to Love and Philosophy. This is a conversation with the philosopher Alva Noë. Alva is a professor of philosophy and the chair of the Department of Philosophy at the University of California, Berkeley. He's also a member of the Center for New Media and the Institute for Cognitive and Brain Sciences. He received the Guggenheim Fellowship in 2012. He's also an Einstein Visiting Fellow at the Free University in Berlin. He's the author of many books, which we talk about here. Action and Perception, for example, which is 20 years old, from 2004. His latest one is Entanglement, How Art and Philosophy Make Us What We Are. That's from 2023. And he also wrote other books you've probably heard of, like Strange Tools or Out of Our Heads, Infinite Baseball, Varieties of Presence. And I really love this conversation. We touch on so many things that I care about. Some of the main themes of his work relative to philosophy, human perception, self-organization, self-awareness. We also talk about how our early life experiences shape and extend into the work we end up doing. We talk about this idea of work and what it really means. Alva kind of sees work as, what does he say, a fundamental mode of being, I think he calls it. He's sort of dedicated to that, and that is actually connected to love in a very deep sense that we explore here from different angles. Also, this word striving comes up a lot, and that's not necessarily meant as a bad thing. He says something like, maybe being present is hard. I think that's important to think about sometimes. Not that it's just this graceful, easy thing, but that maybe we have to work in order to be present. It's an interesting side of being here now. He also talks about love as a life process, something that's, I think, making us and remaking us, and how there's really nothing harder than holding another person in view and actually feeling intimate. And yet at the same time, if that's what we're all trying to do in very different ways and from very different perspectives. Alva and I had this conversation in the summer, the end of the summer. I'm always way behind posting these conversations because they're for research, and I need to look through them and deal with them for research before I edit them and post them. So it usually takes a couple months. But in any case, this one I think we did in August when I was in the United States. And then I had to go to Singapore for work. And on my way back, I had a flight through Helsinki, and it just happened that Alva's 20th anniversary conference, or some people there were putting on a conference for him because it was 20 years since he wrote Action and Perception, and it's changed a lot of people's lives. And interestingly enough, when I was on the plane going to Helsinki, I watched a film called Perfect Days, which was made by Wim Wenders in, I think, 2023. And the script is written by Takuma Takasaki, I think. It's filmed in Tokyo. I bring it up because it's about a janitor and the way he looks at the world and the detail he takes in his job and in looking at the trees and just being present. And I hadn't remembered it, but in this conversation, Alva actually talks about a short story, one of the first short stories he wrote, or maybe it was his first attempt to write a short story, which was about a janitor in his everyday life, not really being about being a janitor, but about observing the world and being present in the world. So there's another little loop that was really interesting when I listened back to this talk, because that movie, Perfect Days, kind of stayed with me for the same reason that this conversation means a lot and has stayed with me. And as a way of trying to send you a little love today, I'm going to do something a little unusual and read a poem. It's kind of a weird thing to do, but in this talk, he brings up a poem by Delmar Schwartz, and that reminded me of a poem by Derek Walcott. And I'm going to read it just to kind of close off this intro, but the reason I'm reading it is because one of the themes that goes throughout this conversation, and that's also a major part of my research that I'm very interested in trying to find ways to explain, goes all the way back to Hegel and complex systems and all of this, and the spiral that I talk about with Ian McGilchrist. And you know, if you listen to the conversation, it's a theme, but this looping that's not a looping, that's a spiral, this stance that is within itself not static, this paradox that we hold and in so holding realize it's beyond itself, this looping motion or practice, again, that I do feel in the writing, but you can never really quite say exactly in words, of coming back to ourselves and knowing ourselves, of seeing ourselves from a different position, only to realize that's the position we're in. And there's something just so gorgeous about it, and it's obsessed me for my whole life, since I first read philosophy. And yeah, here's a poem that sort of expresses it too. It's called Love After Love by Derek Walcott. The time will come when, with elation, you will greet yourself arriving at your own door, in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome and say, "Sit here, eat." You will love again the stranger who was yourself. Give wine, give bread, give back your heart to itself, to the stranger who has loved you all your life, whom you ignored for another, who knows you by heart. Take down the love letters from the bookshelf, the photographs, the desperate notes. Peel your own image from the mirror. Sit, feast on your life. Okay. Hi, Alva. We already said hi a bit, but thank you so much for being here today and for doing this.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me.
I know you've been traveling a lot. You're finally back in California, and I've flipped too, and I'm in the States, so that's why I have this crazy background. But I'm glad we found a time to talk, because I've been, walking around listening to you, on audiobooks, and then reading, of course, your books too. And there's just so much. It's so rich. But to get into it, I was going to ask you if we could start a bit with the idea of organization, which is a word I love a lot that you use, but maybe about your path, your journey. When did you begin to sort of notice your own habits, or begin to think of this idea that you could think of your own consciousness and maybe even have some agency of organization over it?
What a great question. Oh my God. I feel so privileged to have that question, because it's not a question I've actually asked. But it's the minute you say it, I feel like, oh yeah, actually, I've always been very aware of myself, even from a very young age. Like a young kid. I mean, I remember, I kept a diary when I was a kid, like starting at around, well, how old was I in 1976? I guess I must have been about 10 or 11. And I remember, because I happen to remember, because that was the bicentennial year, but I can remember.
I was about to say, how do you remember the year? My goodness, but that's awesome.
Well, because I can actually, I have an image in my mind of my notebook and like writing July 4th. I just have this, I associate it with that year. But I remember, I was precociously in love with this girl. And she lived with her mother and her brother. And I remember I used to want to share my life with them and let them know where I was and what I was doing. I just remember being very, very conscious of the fact that, yeah, life was kind of organized around habit. And here I was in this place, and then I go to school along this path. And she lived there, and that's how she got home from school.
Oh wow! So you were already thinking about like the regularities and so on.
Yeah. And I remember one of my first ideas for a short story, which I never executed, or I never successfully executed, but was for like a house cleaner who cleaned the house, but whose real joy in life was sort of keeping track and monitoring monitoring the lives of the people whose houses he cleaned, and that there was a kind of fascination with human habit, human regularity. I never, of course, would have framed it in those terms. So in a way, I'm a very lucky person, because I'm paid to write and teach and talk about ideas, and that's really all that's ever really mattered to me since the time I was a little child. Yeah.
It's interesting that it came through writing, because maybe we'll get to it, or we can get to it now. But I think a lot when I'm reading you, and just also in other work that I'm trying to figure out about the role representation plays. And by representation, I don't mean in the head, for those of you who think I mean that. I mean like what you were talking about with your notebook and writing, and what you talk about it this way too, with writing is important, and especially in Entanglement. I wonder, like, what was the kind of phenomenology of that, or I mean, if you can remember as a kid, of, because when you talk about it, I remember it too. I also had like a little journal, and it feels like the beginning of my self in a way when I look back at it. I just wonder, is there any continuity to you writing in that journal and thinking about those things, and kind of also what you just expressed about being so lucky to be doing what you're doing?
Yeah, you're reminding me of one of my favorite poems is by Delmore Schwartz, and the opening line is, "I no more wrote than read that book, which is the self I am." In other words, I'm not the author of myself, and I don't know myself because I'm a process that I'm trying to figure out in the middle of it. But of course, I think there's a way in which that's exactly wrong. We do write ourselves, and we do create ourselves in writing ourselves, not necessarily with a pencil and paper, but we we act, we dance, we play, we work, we love, we seek friendships, but we also are always both aware of the fact that we're witnessed by other people and also trying to catch ourselves in the act of doing it. And the act of trying to catch oneself in the act is transformative. It changes us, it reorganizes us, self-consciousness. I've been reading a book recently. It's not a new book, but it's a very, very good book. It's called Love and Its Place in Nature by Jonathan Lear, the psychoanalyst. It's a really, really good book. These are my words, not his words, but he sort of talks how in the psychotherapeutic setting, there's kind of a way in which the self is made. The self emerges through the conversation, through the dialogue. And I guess I believe that, and I've always sort of experienced that that the work of writing it down is also the work of becoming. That connection is very clear, I think, in the arts. Take choreography, for example. On the one hand, choreography is dance, it's movement, it's embodied, it's beyond language, it's beyond concept. And yet the very word choreography is sort of writing, the graphy is it's about writing the body. It's about keeping track or finding articulation or organization or pattern or meaning. So there is an interesting way in which the dancer, while on the one hand, moving beyond the word and the written word and the concept, is actually creating the resources to write themselves down. If that makes any sense. That's a pretty free thought. Yeah, I mean, I think the impulse that the artist has to tell their story, or the writer has, the philosopher has. Philosophers have this impulse. Think of Descartes. He wrote his Meditations, which was a sort of a first-person narration of where he is. And even in his book, in his discourse on method, he similarly is practically reflecting on the ways of making knowledge, the ways of understanding. There's an Italian philosopher who I've discovered, who I love, although I find him very difficult to read. His name is Vico, and he's a little bit younger than Descartes, but he's interestingly the anti-Descartes. So whereas Descartes thinks that everything, that knowledge is really grounded in sort of definitions and inferences and the logical deductive method and something like geometry, so that starting from first principles, you can figure it all out. Vico is more interested in language and culture and poetry and communication and style and literature and the kind of knowledge that gets expressed in really understanding what other people are saying and their nuance and their inflection and their ironies and their play. And he also wrote an autobiography, but Vico wrote his in the third person, which I think is very cool. He wrote his autobiography from the point of view of the other, because he had this idea, I think, that we live outside of our heads in relation to the other.
Yeah.
So that's very inspiring.
Is that the person you talk about in Entanglement too? With the, do you mention?
I do mention him. Yeah, it's not Entanglement. Yeah, I do talk about him. I talk
And
about
with
him.
the paradox and Dreyfus, is that the same or is that
Yeah,
different?
yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. That is
Because
the
I was
same.
thinking of paradox as you were talking too, and
Right.
this, like what you started with, or the poem about reading and writing and not being the reader or the writer. I'm not sure I said that right, but and it reminded me of the poem. I'm not sure if it was Delmore Schwartz, but also where you hear someone knock at the door and you open it and you meet yourself for the first
Mm,
time or something. And also I think about T.S. Eliot, returning to the place you started and knowing it for the first time. And also the quote,
mm,
which is at the beginning of one of your books, I think it's Entanglement, about if you wanted to see something new, then walk the same path every day. There's
yeah,
something, and the way you talk about looping, there's a kind of
yeah,
practice or a
yeah,
movement to
yeah,
this that for me
yeah,
feels like holding the paradox. That's how I often put it. Because you're
yeah,
not trying
yeah,
to reconcile opposites or not see that things are different.
yeah.
You're seeing that everything could have a different opposite from a different point of view or something. Yeah, and something about representation is part of that process,
Mm,
isn't it? Or
yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of paradoxes kicking around. So one of, like in connection with Vico and Dreyfus, um, Dreyfus had this idea that um, what we really know um, is is that when we're is that when we're really engaged with living, ourselves kind of disappear, and we just get in the flow and open up to the world around us. Um, and so there's a way in which let's see, how should I put this? Uh, the hardest thing it is to know is yourself. Um, but then Vico has this idea that the things we know best are the things we make. Um, but then that raises the question, well, if making is sort of like Dreyfus understands it, where when you make it, you kind of just get involved with the flow, then how do we ever really get aware of what it is we're doing when we're making?
yeah.
So this idea of needing to use that word I used before, the problem of catching yourself in the act,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
um, and
Yeah.
and that always changes. It always changes things to do that. So
Yeah.
that was a bit of a winding and I think maybe slightly confused comment.
Not at all. I like it. It's trying to get into things that are really hard to talk about but that I want to talk about that mean a lot because, for example, this idea of presence, or, I mean, already you were talking about the dancing and the choreography, and somehow there's a way in which when we represent things, then we open up new possibilities for how to do them in a sense. And I guess sometimes we could confuse what we make with the making and the doing, maybe relative to what you just said
Mm,
or something. But the thing is, the thing that's hard to hold in what you were just saying, what it brought up is this idea of presence or flow. Because if you're the dancer, let's stick with that. You don't want to be thinking about the choreography really when you're dancing, or is what's like, that's kind of the weird space too, where and you show this too. I mean, this is almost like a practice that you're offering, even in the
yeah,
way that you write it. And this
yeah,
practice opens you up to new forms of agency, but it's also kind of a portal to not have to uh what I don't want to say think, because we're that would be too hard, but to just be present too, but know you're present. So I don't know.
yeah, yeah,
What does that
yeah,
bring up for you?
yeah. That's wonderful, wonderful line of thought. I mean, I think that right, the idea that you might have the view that if anything comes for free in life, it's being there. Like you're just born, you just are, you're just there.
But you don't know you are
Um,
yet.
yeah, but
Or do you?
even beyond knowing it, the idea that maybe presence is hard, maybe you need to work to achieve it, to actually be in the room, be here
Mm.
now, be with you now.
This is a point I want to dig into a little bit, because is it that it's like when you're just born or when you're just here, we could think of different kinds of forms of life, like consciousness at the most like just being aware, alive. I don't know how you want to describe it. You don't necessarily know that you are. And it can be hard in terms of painful, but it's a different kind of hard. Once you come to know it, I mean, like come to know yourself for the first time in all these ways we've already been talking about, this practice of becoming aware of yourself, that feels very hard, right? And almost like you need time and practice to even be able to handle becoming aware of yourself in the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I guess I would say, And by the way, these are ideas that I think remind me of some of Thomas Fuchs's ideas, who I know you know very well. But, I think we are always in relation with others. So there's a way in which there is no I before there's a we. And there's always a we at the beginning. After all, we're born we slip out of the body of another person. So there's a sense in which we're literally, we have to work, we have to strive to become, we have to strive to write that book, which is the self we are, because it's unwritten. And the mere physical existence of this organism isn't enough. There's more that has to happen before we really take shape. And I think that has two sides. It has to do with achieving the world's presence, being able to come into relationship with what is there around you. If you're caught, if you're stuck, if you're ignorant, if you're angry, if you're indifferent, if you're depressed, you can't come into relationship with what there is around you. Growing, flourishing, learning, language, all the different things that we learn about how to use and hold and move our bodies, all of that gives us resources for being with others, being with the environment. So we need to do so much so that there is a world for us. And the flip side of that is that achievement of the world is the achievement of ourselves in a way. It's the performance or an action of ourselves. And that to me is, I think life is hard. You can probably sort people into two different sorts. The kind of think that the basic process of living, consciousness and the works are sort of easy and automatic and biological and just happen. Or people like me who think that it's all a kind of striving. It's all a kind of working towards. Like work for me, this is kind of a ridiculous thing to say, but work for me is kind of like the fundamental mode of being. I work to know another. And if I'm dedicated to the work of knowing another, really knowing another, and knowing the other in a way which is good for me and good for the other, that's called love. And it's not easy. Oh God, wish it were easy. But there's nothing harder than holding another in view for yourself and achieving and sustaining intimacy. So this is moving away from presence, but one of the things that I've seen in my work, starting from Action and Perception, which was published 20 years ago, is I started out with this idea that perceptual consciousness is a matter of sort of skillful engagement with the world. And I'm just more and more interested in the ways in which that's hard to do, that's loaded with feeling, and it's loaded with value. It's not sort of just cognitive or just bodily. It's human. So that emotions like love, or I don't know if it's correct to call it an emotion, attitudes, states like love are really life processes. They're processes of living and being that make us and remake us. Actually, let me go back to something you said at the very start. You asked about the word organization. You said it was a word you love, or you like the concept. And I had a lot of pushback from my friends when I started using the word organization, because like one of my friends said, that's like, business school talk, the organization chart of a company, or, in the 1960s or 50s, they used to talk about the organization man, who was like the corporate person. And that was very, very far from what I was interested in talking about. I was trying to find some way of grounding the notion of habit, of grounding the notion of spontaneity, of grounding the notion of automatic coping, which is always integrated. The way you walk, the way you sit, the way you talk, the way you use your hands is tied up to what you're doing. and what you're doing is tied up to the culture you're in and what's expected and what's correct and what's allowed and how you type and how you write and how you sit and how you dress and how you can govern your posture. So there is a sense in which habit is connected to a kind of integration and organization. But, and that's, I think, kind of clear the way I describe it, how you dress and how you sit and how you look and how you act. There's a way in which we're sometimes oppressed by our habits, oppressed by the ways we find ourselves stuck being. You know, I think there's a lot of interest in the culture now. We don't need to get into this, but there's so much interest in the culture now about like rethinking gender, rethinking identity concepts. And I think a lot of that is rooted in this appreciation that, damn, there's so much that we just take for granted about the way we're put together, the way we're organized. Why can't I be different? Why can't I reorganize? Why can't I do it in a different way? Why can't I be the woman? Why can't I be the child? Why can't I be a person? I don't know. That's usually the space where it's talked about in. So I do think that this fundamental basic thing about human life, which is the ways we find ourselves organized habitually, is also something that we can never just take for granted and that we often need to resist.
Maybe when we're representing it, we're doing a kind of disruption or resistance.
Yeah.
It's the reason I like organization. Well, there's a lot to get into here. There's so much that is exciting for me, but that word for me, I think of like an organ or an instrument or maybe the root of that whole word, which is really a kind of, it holds this thing of representation with it in a way because, gosh, how to say this? I mean, there's the whole ongoing process of life and of being alive and of action as perception and perception as action. I mean, what's going on, however we want to describe it. But then we do make things like we were talking about, even if it's choreography of a dance. It doesn't have to be an object, but often objects through language and so on, we represent. And for me, that's kind of an organ or an instrument or something. I mean, so it's not that I can understand what your friends were saying, that it does sound like you're trying to put things in a certain way, but that's only if you don't understand that there's this process going on by which we kind of share via instruments, whatever, or technologies or tools or, however you might say it, that as you were saying before, we're sort of trying to help each other, reorganize each other, but also something I think is very important to you is the emancipatory potential of that, the liberation, like, as you were saying, we're stuck in our habits, but we don't know we even have the habit. So, and again, it's kind of like what we were talking about before, where you become aware of yourself, you become aware of your habits through one another. And this is a kind of agency, or what do you?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Is it a kind of agency? Agency is one of those words I also don't like the word representation. I use it occasionally in exactly the way you're using it. So I don't object to your use of it, but I do think it's a word that tends to make people go, like, what is it? What is representation?
I agree.
So it needs to be used with real caution. I mean, one way I like to think about it is, and this is directly on the point you were making, insofar as we're a problem to ourselves, we seek to kind of understand what we are and what we're doing. And in that sense, to kind of capture ourselves or fix ourselves or represent ourselves to ourselves. It's this thing we do. So it's like we try to, in some sense, make a map or make a representation.
Or to use language, right? I mean, for me, language is a representation. It's the only kind of representation, which I'm glad you brought that word up. I really don't think we have internal. We can, the thing is, we can make representations of internal patterns that are going to be consistent. But I think this gets very, very confused. And that's one reason I still use the word, because I think it's a problem that we have to solve. But I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah. So just to get kind of academic for a second, I like to think that like we do things with language. We talk and negotiate and argue and fight and flirt and criticize and tell and disclose and reveal and attack. We use language for all these different things. It's just kind of silly to think this should be one word representation that refers to all of that. Like language is doing, language is part of our animality, our sociality. And, I think there's a philosophical tradition that wants to say, no, we use language to represent the world, report, describe states of affairs, say whether or not they're true or false. I think that's just that's one of the many things we do with language. So another kind of representation in the traditional sense is pictorial representation. And that's also, as I write a lot about in my book, The Entanglement, that's also very mixed up. And there's a lot of different senses of the term picture or that kind of representation can be interestingly criticized and unpacked.
Mm-hmm.
But where I think you and I are exactly in sync and in agreement is that we appreciate that there is this urge to bring us into focus for ourselves, and that doing so changes us. And that's really exciting. And language definitely has that function. When you and I talk, we also reflect on our talking, and we try to cope with like right now, actually, discrepancies in the way we're using the word representation. So language becomes a problem for us. That is to say, what we're doing, how best to understand what we're doing becomes a problem for us.
Yeah, this word problem is another thing I wanted to bring up, because you often talk about the problem, right? And in a positive sense almost. And I do, just for representation, we could go on and on about that, so we will bracket it after this. But I really literally mean kind of that we find a way to meet somewhere. I mean, maybe later you could help me think about that better, but it's like it's that we create, literally, I kind of mean like the way we wrote on cave walls and stuff. Like there's some sense in which we find this third space that's just a place where we can at least agree on the regularities enough to communicate, I guess. But the process of actually speaking and communicating, I would never say is a representation. But
good. But
the problem.
It's funny, when I first met my wife, who's not a philosopher, she was really surprised about the way I used the word problem, and nobody had ever mentioned that to me before. Because for philosophers, a problem is a great thing. Like, you're looking for a problem to do your dissertation on. You want a problem.
And what's the problem you're going to solve?
And the history of philosophy is the history of great problems. And what you do when you teach philosophy courses, you don't give solutions, you give problems, and you try to show how do you know that there is an external world? That's a problem. How do you know that yesterday really happened? That's a problem. How do you know that God exists? That's a problem. How do you know that you're free to do what you wish? That's a problem. So for me, and this is a kind of philosopher's thing, problems are good. Problems are juicy opportunities for reorganization.
It's great that your wife brought that up, because that was important for me too, to sort of make clear here, because I mean, speaking of habits and philosophy, in certain analytic environments I've been in, the problematization becomes almost like a fetish or something. Like, you're almost, who can be the best at finding the problems in what's being said, and you kind of but that's not, I mean, that can, so there's extremes of this. But I guess what I wanted for a kind of more an audience who's all over the place is like, where's the problem fitting into this? Because we have this practice which you present in many different ways of that we're sort of through art or through philosophy, and we could go into each of those. There is a kind of practice in which we can reorganize ourselves. And how do you see like problems fitting into that in a sort of, I don't know, maybe in art or in philosophy, or is, for example, with beholding an artwork or something, I don't know. Because it has to do with this presence and waking up part too, I think.
I'm so glad that you've read my books and that you kind of are interested in these questions, because that's exactly what I'm thinking about. For me, I said before how hard living is. Well, I think one of the things which is much harder than we usually appreciate is really seeing something, really seeing the thing in front of you, as opposed to just working on your label or your assumption or your expectation. but to actually let the thing be there for you, see it, that takes work. That takes a certain kind of attentional work. And I think
it's kind of uncomfortable too.
And it can be, if you pay attention, it can be uncomfortable. In fact, in practical life, it's important that when I'm walking down the street, I'm not like, whoa, I have to get from A to B. That's important too. And, for certain purposes, life is embedded in the tasks of perception is embedded in the tasks of living, and that's good. But one of the things that I think art does is it curates opportunities to do that work of moving from not seeing to seeing, or from seeing to seeing differently, really coping with where you are. Artworks always exceed what can be taken in at a glance in ways that are challenging. The artwork says, what am I? In my book, Strange Tools, I said, the artwork says, see me if you can. You think you can see me. You think you know what I am. But look again, you don't have a clue. But, says the artwork further, if you pay attention a bit more and work with me, maybe you'll get somewhere. And maybe something will happen. Maybe you'll reorganize yourself. And that's interesting for two reasons. One, because it kind of shows why art is tied up with human consciousness, but it also shows why it's not the art that matters, it's human consciousness. And in a way, that practice of bringing the world into focus is something we try to do throughout our lives and all the time. This reminds me of one of my favorite quotes, which I think I give somewhere in the Entanglement. It's from a French Fluxus artist named Robert Filliou. And he said, art is what makes life more interesting than art.
Yeah, I love that too. I hadn't heard it till I read it.
And it's such an amazing idea. And that's, in a way, I just sort of capture that thought here. It's art sheds light on consciousness, but in a way, what makes art special is the fact that consciousness is special, and learning about consciousness is special. Obviously, there's many different kinds of art, doing many different kinds of work. I don't mean to put it all under sort of a thimble, but to speak in very general terms, I do think that art gives us opportunities to do that work. To put it the way I was putting it before, of coming into relationship with where we are, who we're with, what we're looking at, the situation we're in. And then, and so you have to connect to close off the loop. And so, art, like life itself, confronts us with problems for being in relationship. And that's what philosophy does too. Philosophy just tends to do it in a different space, in a more intellectual space. But the effect is the same. The philosopher asks us to, in effect, realize that the things we think we know are not stable. Therefore, we need to try to know them all again. But there isn't any such thing as finally knowing them. So there's a kind of philosophy invites you to go unstable, to let it go, and see what happens.
For me, this is really crucial, important, and something that I think relates to another important part of your writing and your work, which is that philosophy doesn't need to try to be science, because what you're describing there for me relates to love in a way, and sort of in the way you've already brought up, because when you're in a love relationship, we're all in love, I guess, already, but you're kind of waking up to be able to handle that in a sense that we're talking about. And whether that's through another human being, or that's through looking at an artwork maybe, or creating an artwork, or reading a book, or I would say it could come in many ways that we wake up to that part of ourselves. But as you said, it's dynamic, and it's always going, it's always moving, it always needs to be re-seen. I mean, I want to push you a little bit on the seeing thing, but we'll get to that. But first, for me, that is kind of what's different from something like science and something like the way we were talking about representation, where in that kind of an organization, you need different kinds of ways of doing it. And I mean, I'm just opening up some kind of doors. I won't give you my view of it, but when I was reading you, I was thinking about this, about how people in my circles, even not with Thomas Fuchs, but in the neuroscience world, are trying to science-ify philosophy in a sense, and that it feels like we're hurting something that would be like trying to science-ify art. You express it better in your books, but what does that open up for you?
Yeah, well, absolutely. That's you've said it extremely well. There's two crucial points, 1 and 2. 1, science and art are different. Science and philosophy are different. And they differ in this, that art and philosophy, unlike science, never have clear-cut standards or practices for measuring their own success. They can't take for granted the standard by which they could say, I've succeeded. And one of the nice revelations about that is when you study a philosophy text, you don't sort of memorize the findings. There are no findings. You memorize, if anything, the arguments, which is to say the pathways to the findings, so that you can make those arguments your own or think creatively with them. So philosophical texts, like artworks, become something like scores for having experience by. Now, so that's the first point. But the second point is, and now I take it all back, is I think art and philosophy and science are entangled with each other. So there are artistic moments inside science, and there are scientific moments inside philosophy. And those lines are never drawn sharply, because we're not just one thing. We're always in motion in relation to our own questions. So a scientist might begin thinking they know what the standard of they know what their test is trying to prove, but then the experiments comes up with unconclusive results that force them to get philosophical about what they were presupposing. And that's what Einstein did with thinking about space and time. And he realized that we couldn't just take the meaning of those terms for granted. They needed to be something as basic as, what does it mean to say that two events happen at the same time?
Yeah.
All of a sudden that needs to become a problem.
Exactly.
That was not a problem. We were just measuring events. All of a sudden that becomes a problem. And that's philosophy. So I think that, Einstein was a great philosopher. He was also a great scientist, and many of the greatest philosophers, Leibniz, Descartes, Berkeley, were also great scientists in the truest sense of the word. So, in a way, I think there's a really interesting way in which that entanglement means that we can never dogmatically say, oh, that's just science, or oh, that's just philosophy. Well, those are fighting words. Those are we can't just take that for granted. At the same time, I think there's all the difference in the world between science and philosophy.
It's wonderful that you say it like that, because again, I mean, my whole thing and what I'm obsessed with is this kind of common patterns and holding the paradox and how to talk about it in a weird way, because our language is sort of patterned by dichotomies. And I mean, you kind of disrupted this with your book 20 years ago, but we can come back to that. But what you're saying, I think, is wonderful. And it's not that what hurts me sometimes is to see that we try to think that this particular quality of philosophy and art that we've been talking about needs to feel like the quality of science, right? Or as if you have to choose one or the other. That's the thing. We don't have to choose, but when we're engaging and orienting, we can orient scientifically or philosophically towards the same process, right? With different, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think to really discuss this in more nuance, it'd be interesting to look at actual scientific practice and actual, say, practice inside neuroscience. I think I have become more and more over time increasingly skeptical of neuroscience. Not because I want anybody to stop asking questions or stop doing the research, but because the things that, at least when we're talking about neuroscience in the space of the human or the human mind, very few of the concepts we use to characterize our experience or our consciousness or our cognition are themselves stable, fixed, and unproblematic. Memory, perception, awareness, sentience, empathy, compassion, you name it. There's room for philosophy there. And I think often neuroscience in the interest of coming up with experimental results, or that is instrumentalizing a concept for the purpose of using it inside an experiment, ends up missing missing the concept. And so there's a kind of almost. So the way I put it in my newest book, and I'm changing all the time the way I'm thinking about it, but the way I put it in my newest book is that human beings are problems in the way we were just talking about. Specifically, they're aesthetic problems to ourselves, meaning we can't even really see ourselves. It's like looking at ourselves is a bit like looking at an artwork. You can see ourselves this way or this way. It's never fixed. It's always richly indeterminate. So what does it mean to study the neural substrates of an indeterminate phenomenon? So this is why I'm often annoyed at what seems to me like a falsification or a reductionism in neuroscience that goes in the wrong direction.
I understand. Sometimes we also think that there's something about like noticing the regularities that can be very helpful if you're trying to understand mental illness and things like this. Or, there's a wonderful richness to noticing the regularities and so on. But when we start talking about consciousness, we often confuse what I'm calling representations, but the measurements we've made or the assessments we've made with the process itself that's dynamic and ongoing, as you've described, and different for everyone, as you also, show in the work. But we could go in that forever. Feel free to say what you want to say, but I also want to talk about seeing a little bit too.
Okay. Well, one very brief comment on that, just as a sort of a friendly comment before we turn to seeing. I actually think that the best neuroscience is medical in its orientation, like the work of neurologically oriented psychiatrists. Actually, by the way, this is not an original comment, but it's an amazing fact about the brain sciences that in 2024, we still have so many different names for them. And people talk about cognitive neuroscience and neuropsychiatry and psychology and psychiatry and neurology versus neuroscience. And it's so interesting that, this is the piece that I'm sure I've heard somebody else say. If we have a lot of names for phenomena, it's probably because we don't really know what we're talking about, or we haven't really figured it out. And I think that's really something for neuroscience to be sort of humble about, that we're in that state. But one of the areas that I really like the most and have the greatest, I feel is in a way the most rigorous, is medically oriented brain studies. And I say that because very often people who work in those areas, like Thomas Fuchs or like Oliver Sacks, is they're forced to keep the whole person in view. And the living human, the living human being is in view.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's
a great way to say it. Yeah, because that's what gets lost in a lot of the.
Yeah. Okay, seeing.
Okay, seeing. Well, I can even bridge with the neuroscience, because with the neuroscience I studied the hippocampus more theoretically, because I feel like it's kind of it's an area of the brain where we can start to see how to hold paradox. But and with Action and Perception, your book from 20 years ago, which is pretty cool that the anniversary is coming up. I feel like something that was important, like a realization that people might have had or something disruptive about that book, was that it called into question this notion that perception is in the brain. And it kind of brought us into the body, and that perception is action. And there would be so much more to say about that. But in the book, to get to seeing, there's a lot about touch, and there's a lot about, I don't know, I invite you to completely disagree with this, but when I'm reading that book, I feel like the whole body is a perception instrument or something, and touch is the best way to describe it, because it's somehow with our eyes we are also touching, and with our ears we're touching, and everything is touch. But then by the time I get to Entanglement, I feel like we're talking about seeing a lot in that, and with good reason, and artwork and stuff. But I just wanted to bring that up for you, and that in this context of paradox and stuff we've been talking about, or getting beyond dichotomy, or I wonder how you see that touching the way you saw it 20 years ago, and the seeing now. And yeah.
Oh, that's great. So my understanding, are you really asking, is it sort of a backwards move to be focusing so much on seeing? Is that in a way what
I
you're
guess
saying?
I'm wondering because I almost think by seeing you also mean something more than just looking with
Yeah,
your eyes. So it's almost
yeah,
like, yeah, I mean, you're
yeah,
still talking about it that way, but
yeah,
the examples feel very vision oriented, but the results do not feel vision oriented, I guess I would say.
yeah. That's yeah. I So in the Entanglement, I have a chapter on writing, I have a chapter on dancing, I have a chapter on pictures. Um, so it's actually it's organized. There's a chapter on writing, there's a chapter on pictoriality, and there's a chapter on choreography. So choreography stands to the moving body, as pictoriality stands to the seeing body, as writing stands to the speaking body. So I'm interested in those kinds of representational schemes and the way they loop down and change what they represent. Um,
Yeah, I'm sorry. I should also say learning to look. And I mean, I've actually looked at a lot of your
yeah,
work. For some reason, it feels like there's more of a focus
yeah,
on the art, the dancing and even that, I'm not even trying to like criticize and say you've gone to seeing. I'm
yeah,
just trying to open it up of
yeah,
trying to
yeah,
understand how you see what perception really is. Is it still a, is it, is it a embodied whole bodied process or yeah, how do you think about that?
yeah. Um, right. So the first thing about, and by the way, I'm actually starting a new project with the art historian Alexander Nagel
Uh,
on the history of painting and perspective. I'm so interested in these questions. And one of the things I want to argue, and this was in action and perception already, is that it's a mistake to think of vision as optical, right? So we have this whole
yes.
tradition of thinking about light, creating a mapping on the retina, and we have a sort of an internal picture, and then we
Yes.
compute a representation of the scene. Um, I want to say that no, seeing is more like hugging someone.
Exactly.
It's
Yeah.
more like climbing a mountain.
Yeah.
That seeing is like that.
That's what I was trying to get to. And out of our
Yeah,
heads, you also give this example of how we can see without our eyes, so to speak.
yeah,
So that's what
that's
I'm
right.
trying to dig into right
Yeah,
there.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I totally think that. Um, uh, so that means that like there's nice paradoxes in the space of this. For example, one of the interesting paradoxes is that we can see more than is visible.
Yeah.
Because if you think of what is visible as just what projects to your eyes, we're not confined to what projects to the eyes. Um, and one of the things I'm writing about is how, in a way, perspectival painting developed, in the 15th century, um, developed a kind of account of the visible world and took that to then constrain visual experience.
Mm.
But actually, the visual world has never been like it's represented inside a perspectival painting. And drawing on art historical work of Alexander Nagel, I'm trying to show that very quickly Renaissance painters themselves tried to explode the limits of perspective by making moves within their artistic strategies that couldn't make sense of in perspective. In particular, they got interested in life-size painting and in bodily scale,
Mm.
which has no particular standing or interest from a purely perspectival point of view. What I just said maybe was completely unintelligible because I was referring to quite subtle internal arguments to this thing I'm now doing. But this is just to say that for me, how to think about vision, specifically vision, um, is really an interesting and outstanding and burning kind of problem for me. It's something I'm still,
Mm.
after all these years, um, where I've discussed how we see and what seeing is so many times. I'm still concerned with it and still feel that
Mm.
there's ways in which it troubles us. Now, often when I say see, I'm actually just speaking more generally about perception, where I don't necessarily mean the visual modality.
Mm.
So, for example, blind people actually that's a funny term because blindness doesn't come in one size. And people who are so-called legally blind have all different degrees of partial vision. So in a way, blind people are really just people who see differently.
Exactly,
Ironically.
yeah. It's
Yeah,
just that what regularities the majority of people associate with something
yeah,
like
that's right.
seeing,
That's right.
they have different ones.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. They have different ones. And then among them, there's many, many, many different ones within
Yeah.
the community of the so-called blind. But
Mm-hmm.
but the point is that the blind live in a world that is as replete with shape, size, meaning, spatial extent, and maybe even color as our worlds. That is, we supposedly normally sighted people. So I'm interested. I am interested in trying to explode and to rethink what the visual is. I'm not really answering you very clearly.
No,
Here's
it's
a good.
wonderful. I think it's an important point, and I think there's other, like, people are starting to, there's something about seeing without eyes, and someone asked me if I wanted to have a dialogue with someone who's writing about that, so I haven't looked into it, but it's exactly what I wanted to open up a
Yeah,
bit, because
yeah,
I think
yeah,
your work is opening it up. And as you were
yeah.
talking, I was also thinking of Dreyfus, who I think has also been important for you. And for some reason, I was remembering him talking about, like, Cezanne, the art was not about seeing, it was about expressing almost like a bodily state or something. And it's so hard to talk about, but I think about it a lot in art. If you look over time at different styles that have come, they're not about seeing in a vision sense. They're about how we're being in the world, right? You can link that stuff. I don't
Absolutely.
know.
So Cezanne is fantastic on that topic, and Merleau-Ponty wrote an essay called Cezanne's Doubt, which is a beautiful study of Cezanne's work as a kind of a paradigm for what the phenomenologist is trying to do. And Merleau-Ponty says things about Cezanne like Cezanne was trying to see as if no one had ever seen before, encountering a world that had not yet been fabricated and constructed according to our own ideologies.
Mm.
He talks about how the poet speaks as if no one has ever spoken before, like actually not just reusing sampling language, but inventing language. And that Cezanne, going back to the painter, was concerned with expressing appearances exactly, and that's an infinite task.
Mm.
So there's a weird way in which I'm just riffing on your mention of Dreyfus and Cezanne. There's a way in which the artist is doing something godlike, is doing something with all the expansiveness and power of infinite creativity. And you're right. It's not connected to the blindness and disability issue. We talk about vision the way people in industry might talk about fast fashion or something. Like we just assume we know what we're talking about. Like
Mm-hmm.
t-shirts. This is a t-shirt. This is a visual experience. But what is a visual experience?
Yeah.
What is clothing? Target's t-shirts, H&M underwear. Those are prefab concepts,
Mm-hmm.
and visual experience is a prefab concept. That's the other thing Merleau-Ponty says, talking about Cezanne. He says, the very idea that we see in different modalities at all is the imposition of a scientific idea on lived human experience. In lived human experience, there is no touch as opposed to sight, as opposed to smell, as opposed to taste. There's just our being with the world, being in the world, being with the world. And then we develop a model. Well, there's the brain, and there's the eyes, and there's the ears, and there's different channels of information processing. And all of a sudden we have this knowledge. Every child learns 5 senses. just like they learn that there are cows and there are goats and there are dogs
but there's
and there are barns.
many hundreds of senses really, and they're all one process. That has to do with that thing. We won't go into representation again, but how we've studied it, and sort of put it into static things, and then we take those as if those are the real thing, but they're not. We've lost that.
So I do think that some people thinking about disability, not just blindness, but other forms of disability, I think are very inventive on these issues, because they also realize that it's not just phenomenology which is at stake, but it's respect for their lives which is at stake. Different lives led differently.
Yeah, and I think it's so important, and it gets to beautiful parts of entanglement, and we can come back to reorganization and organization a little bit. But because as you were describing, like you talk about style a lot, we probably don't have time to go into that, but this idea of like habits that have kind of created almost like streets or paths that we're all born into and we take for granted, of like what you're saying about what's a cool t-shirt or what's this or what's that. And all of these we don't quite realize are habits that could be changed or that aren't necessarily the same for everyone according to different abilities instead of disabilities. And so I feel like within entanglement, you're showing this process of how through philosophy and art, through, you can correct me, but through somehow becoming aware of whatever it is that's in front of us. It could be an artwork, it could be the nature, I guess, it could be a book, I don't know, idea, that we can then develop some way in which we notice our own habits or our own participation in habits, which then changes what's possible for that kind of thing that we're noticing or focusing on or observing, the creation of that, and vice versa, and so on. I don't know, but how would you better clarify?
Yeah, that's a complicated intersection.
Entangled.
Entangled. One of the ways I put it is that we're not just creatures of habit, we're creatures of style. And part of what that comes down to is that human beings are always not just exposed to other human beings, but we experience ourselves as we are or might be experienced by others. So we have style. So what that means is that everything you do is, to some degree, uniquely your way of doing it, so that another sees you in the way you do it. Now, I say to some degree or another because one of the interesting things about style is you can imitate a person's style. I can try to talk like you, or I can try to walk like you, or dance like you, or write like you, or do a podcast like you. And so style becomes a kind of currency, or it's tradable, it's exchangeable, it's visible, it's meaningful, it's recognizable. So that we're all the time, I sort of have this image of fireflies flashing their lights in the
I just saw
summer
some
night.
last night, by the way.
Oh, really? Yeah. I think right in the Atlanta area, you would see that.
I was very excited because I hadn't seen them in a long time. So it's great you hear about that.
Yeah. Do you call them lightning bugs or fireflies?
Yeah, lightning bugs.
Lightning bugs. I do. Yeah. I think I grew up calling them fireflies, but lightning bugs, they flash, they fire, they flash at each other. And there's this kind of, and I think that's what we're like. We're constantly flashing at each other. And then based on how people respond to us, we also change ourselves. I don't mean to make it all sound too intellectual. It's a lot of this stuff is not. I think
it's just hard to talk about. It's like you're always. That's why it's a practice, right? That you show in the writing, because you have to hold both of these things at once. That habits are sort of inherited, and also because we're unique spatiotemporal bodies, they're unique. It's at the same time.
Yeah.
And we can, as you kind of express, or, we can want to be identified with certain regularities. And so we take on those regularities, which is taking on the habits, which is a style. But at the same time, we can never escape our body. So we're going to always have something a little bit of a different flash if we're the firefly or whatever. I mean, we're always in different.
Yeah. And another thing about style is that you can criticize another person's style. Like you might not see it. It's a little bit like how hard it is to see, but if you see it, you can say, oh, that's kind of a pretentious style, or that's I don't know, that's awkward or ungainly, or I don't know, whatever you might say, it's critical. But the very fact that it's a space of possible criticism is interesting. It's also a space of possible praise. In my book, Strange Tools, I argue, and this is a piece I wrote, that a chapter in the book that nobody else has ever, very few other people have picked up on it, but I think it's such a clever idea, is I argue that like pop stars are really style stars. They're style artists. What they're really working with is style. And they use music as an instrument to further the cultivation of style, which is why when we go to rock concerts
don't you go to a concert in the book when you're talking about this? Or is that, am I confusing something else? Maybe it's learning.
Yeah, maybe in Learning to Look, I talk about some concerts.
Maybe it's Learning to Look, yeah.
But the idea that we I was just hearing an interview on the radio today with the Swiftie talking about going to a Taylor Swift concert and screaming and shouting and dancing and singing along and dancing and singing along. It's less about listening to the artist make music than it is joining with the artist in some kind of celebration.
Becoming that kind of I don't know. I mean, it relates to this embodied perception, action, flow that we were talking about earlier, where when you're in a group, for example, at a concert, you kind of become that together. I don't know. What is that that's so exciting about that? Is it reminds me of you writing in your notebook, or when you're a little kid or something.
Right.
There's some kind of, it's not that we're reflecting ourselves, but we're almost like expanding.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I don't have a good answer to that. I remember when I was, to get personal again, in 1986, I also remember the year, maybe it was 1985 or 87, but the reason I remember it might have been 85. The reason I kind of remember the year is I was at a protest at Columbia University against the university's investments in South Africa. And I was with my two friends, and one of my friends was saying, well, these mass gatherings are kind of alienating, and they put you in an emotional space that takes you away from the right use of your reason and your reflection and your self-control, and they're dangerous, and we should resist getting caught up in the power of the crowd.
The crowd, like Elias Canetti or something.
Exactly. Yeah. And I was arguing, actually, no, you just need to let go and trust the process, and that, this is a chance to have solidarity with these other people. And I remember we had this interesting argument about it. And
that is interesting.
Both points were true. Like
exactly. Again, I was going to say it's the paradox, because if you're going to let yourself go with the flow, you also need to be present of yourself still, to be able to catch yourself, unveil yourself, so to speak.
Right.
That's a hard thing to learn, isn't it? I mean, you brought up this time period. Like, when did you start thinking that philosophy was the way to deal with these things? Like, was it just a natural flow, and then from there, I think the artist kind of discovered you, and then it kind of went into that? Or I wonder about that organization and reorganization of you and your life. Like,
I'm very lucky, because in a way, I started as a very young person, like 12 or 13 years old. I was already interested in writing, and I quickly got interested in philosophy. I think I was in 8th grade when I read, for the first time, I read a philosophical piece of writing,
What was it? Do you
And
remember? Or
it was it
around?
was it was it was Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Discourse on the Origins of Inequality.
Oh my gosh. In eighth
Um,
grade? Okay.
yeah, yeah, my history teacher gave it to me because we were studying the French Revolution, and she
Awesome.
said you should read this. Um,
Teachers, I love teachers. They give us
yes,
these little things that just sit us on courses for the rest of our life.
absolutely. And she
Hmm.
cared about what I had to say about it. She respected me. She made me feel like my thoughts and opinions were relevant. Yeah,
It
Mrs.
matters so
Gordon,
much.
Mrs. Gordon, she's gone now, but
Oh, thanks for saying her
and
name. I just had
yeah,
dinner with a friend of mine who's a teacher, and I was literally telling her that they're like the most important people in the world for
I
exactly this reason.
yeah, I agree. I agree. Um, and then a little while after that, a carpenter who worked with my father, had a copy of a little book by Sartre called Existentialism and Human Emotions. It was a little slim paperback. I still have it because he gave it to
Oh
me.
wow.
Um, and it was lying around. It was lying around my parents' house, and I read it.
Oh,
And I remember not understanding a lot of it because he talked about Catholicism and there's all sorts of politics in it, like Marxism. I didn't know anything about, but he did talk about this idea that philosophers used to think that your essence preceded your existence, that what you are was fixed, and then you just come into being. Um, but we believe that existence precedes essence, and you can make yourself what you want to be or what you are. Like you can make yourself yourself. And I didn't, I was literally 13 years old, so I didn't understand that the way one would as an adult. But it totally blew my mind. It completely blew my mind. And um, yeah, so I kind of thought that I had a natural attraction to philosophy, but I still didn't really. Since if I can just say a little bit more about myself personally, I
yeah,
didn't really know
please.
what philosophy was.
Mm.
Um,
It was
I
more that
was
you found this exciting
yeah.
book
So,
that,
so for example, I actually thought literature was what I wanted to be.
yeah,
Like I wanted
yeah,
to be a
yeah.
writer. I
Writer,
want,
right.
and I'm reading novels and short stories that seemed to me this really amazing place. And I
Well, that makes sense because you found that. Did you find the power of, was that unveiling you to yourself a bit when you started reading and writing? Or there's something that feels very, yeah, connected to
yeah
what you're doing
yeah
in the
yeah
philosophy there,
yeah
that this looping.
yeah yeah. Well, there were three things that I read, and now maybe I'm in 10th grade by now. One was James Joyce's The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. One was Thomas Mann's short story Tonio Kruger,
Oh, wow.
and
Yeah.
what and do you know that one?
Mm-hmm.
And
Thomas
one
Mann is
was
big for me too.
a crazy not a novella by Robert Musil called Young Turles in English, or in German it's called Die Verwirrung des Zöglings Turles.
Yeah,
Uh,
I also know Robert Musil too. That was a big thing for me. That I think I've read that one before, but I'm having trouble. Is he like,
it's
yeah,
a
anyway,
crazy story about a boy in a military academy, and it involves kind of bullying and brutality and sexual experimentation and um, but anyway, but
so
all
very
these three books,
disruptive, pushing at the edges, all of these books that you
yeah,
described.
it shocked me. All of them shocked
Hmm.
me, and all of them were by boys. All of them were about artists. All of them were about the artists finding themselves and becoming who they were to become,
Hmm.
and in a very romantic way that totally captivated me. And those books really meant a lot to me. Um, and the reason I mention that is that I then went off to college, and I actually I tried writing fiction or poetry, and I never really knew how to do it. I could never do it. I could never figure out how to do it. But
Mm.
when I took a philosophy class, I knew how to do it. Like it just came very natural to me. And by the way, I didn't. I had to learn so much, and I flunked out of things, and I had to work very hard uh, to become good at it. But the interesting thing, and then I'll shut up because I'm going on too long. But the interesting thing for me
Not
personally
at all.
is that I then sort of found my bearings in academic writing, doing philosophy, but gradually over the course of 25, 30 years, worked myself back to the point where I began, which was that what I was really trying to do was at one with this artistic practice. I'm not doing science. I'm not trying to prove little theorems. I'm not trying to make my contribution to a pre-existing problem. I'm trying to free myself in the way art can do, in the ways I find myself being.
That's very beautiful, freeing yourself in the way art can do, because I talked about emancipation, and I do feel like that's kind of what the entanglement, once we understand it's too, what you're trying to say in entanglement, there's a kind of liberation or something. And yeah, that's beautiful. It makes a lot of sense that those books and that they're so much about art, and that they're also connected to another word I wanted to talk to you about, but we'll just kind of touch on it really quickly, is performance. That there's a performative aspect that's not performance like fake, but performance like artistic, a way in which that becomes the process of recognizing or reorganizing and organizing, or where those organizing and reorganizing meet, so to speak. Does that make sense? Or
yeah, because we're not in our heads, we're in what we do. And performance in a way is a term for the most general modalities of our doing. And performance also carries this idea, which is so important to me, that it's not just doing, but it's doing in a social space. It's doing potentially, at least, under the eyes of others. I think there's this whole idea that the real you is hidden away inside of you, but I think actually that the real you is something which is always becoming in performance. So the word I used in action and perception was enactive. It's an enactive approach to perception. We enact our perceptual consciousness in what we do. Sometimes I talk about achievement. Sometimes I talk about performance. Judith Butler talks about performance, and she took that idea from the ordinary language tradition in philosophy to Austin and the idea of speech acts and things like that. So I use it in a slightly different way from her, but I think my usage agrees with hers. Right, the idea that performance isn't superficial, that performance is existential. Yeah, it's very
right,
important
exactly.
to me.
Right back to that Sartre and that stuff of it feels more almost like putting yourself to be seen in the way that we've been talking about sight, right? Which is very hard for us. And I almost feel like our habits as a society, as you were kind of touching on, are almost like to do the opposite now. You hide your real self away, or you're trapped in your brain, right? And so your real self is trapped in your brain. And there's something very liberating about thinking of performance as a space to connect and reorganize and be safe, even as you take risks. I don't know.
Yeah, right. That's like, as a parent, that's what you're trying to let your kid understand, that they can do, they can act, they can be, they can fuck up, excuse my language. And that it's safe to do that. It's safe to try to do things. And in some households, people are too critical. They shut down the freedom that the child has to act.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I want to come to love, right? We have to go. I mean, I could talk forever about a lot of these things, but for now, that what you just described feels to me like love. There's some kind of, I think it's a Winnicott quote or something about the child being able to play in the presence of its mom without knowing its mom is there, or something, where you open up this space where you're safe to be and explore. Does that have to do with, I mean, we've been talking a lot about individual and philosophical and art, but there's also the idea of like a wider idea of organization, in terms of what we are as humans. And do you see a way in which, maybe it's too idealistic, but could we learn to treat each other like that in other areas of life too?
You mean, is it possible to To love each other? Is that what you're asking? I'm not sure I
I
understand.
guess I know it's possible to love each other, but I suppose in something like the performative aspect of one of these ideas of art, or even in philosophy or science, or when we think about like the major challenges that we face as humans, let's even go there, ecologically or mentally, or in terms of what we fight about, we're entangled, right? And understanding that entanglement in the way that you present it, whether through the making, like if we want to think of it as art, or through the theory, if we want to think of it in terms of the philosophy and the way we come up with these guiding habits. I mean, when we realize we're entangled, when we develop this practice that we've been talking about, and I know you don't want to use the word agency, but I do feel like it's a kind of free will or something that
Yeah,
you can
yeah,
unveil
yeah,
yourself to yourself. Does it also
yeah.
give us a chance to look at that differently, maybe from a different place?
Yeah.
Do you ever
By
think
the way,
about that, or is it too big?
yeah, yeah, no, I do. I do. Just quick little parenthetical comment on agency. Um, One of my biggest criticisms of myself, of my writing, or of my view, is that I haven't quite come to grips with the notion of agency. Um, because so much of what we do just happens to us. And so how do we, but yet it's still what we do. Like we let it happen, or we enable it to happen, or we express ourselves and it's happening. So how to find that balance? So since action and perception till now, I've been always trying to find a way to tell a story of the self as both striving and achieving, but also as part of a larger world involving in social phenomenon. Anyway, it's just a term it's just a thing I'm really busy with, in the sense of it's a problem for me.
There's free will and there's not free will. I mean, it's a lot of what we've been trying to do here, and what I think this practice of entanglement is trying to do. If we unstick it from a linear mindset, which is another reason I like organization, because it implies that everything is already there
Yeah,
and there's
yeah,
no
yeah,
beginning or
right.
end, but
That's right.
everything's constantly scaling and
Right.
reconfiguring differently.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Then you have
But
both of these at once. There are parameters by which, of course, you don't have
right,
free will. And then there is, but within that, you do have some.
right, right. To now go back to the other sort of thing you were asking, maybe this is not quite the level you were asking it about, but um, I do think that one of the discoveries that's important to me, you already touched on it, is that science is different from art and philosophy. And I think we need art and philosophy. I mean, we can't escape art and philosophy,
No. Mm-hmm.
even if we try to, but trying to is dangerous. It leads to a culture dominated by science and engineering and sort of a kind of capitalism run amok, I
Mm-hmm.
think. And I'm worried about changes happening in society that have to do with the disvaluation of philosophy and and art, and acting as if they're only really valuable to the degree that they're like science. So philosophy is valued because it is actually making contributions the way science does. And I'm sure you know that in the Netherlands and in many places in the world now, a lot of times the way art is funded is through university degrees. So you have art as research, and that's
Mm-hmm.
great that artists are being funded, but it's kind of bad that they're being funded as if they're science,
Mm.
because I think they should be able to be funded for their own autonomous form of work. Anyway, so I guess I do think that I wish I wish that there were a way to bring this kind of understanding that I'm trying to develop in this work into a more public conversation.
Mm.
Um, like I wish, to use the language you've been using, I wish we could hold paradox in public spaces more readily. You know,
Mm-hmm.
um, I don't want to get into politics, but just a very interesting thing that happened recently was the controversy over uh, President Biden's cognitive decline, his perceived cognitive decline. And I just thought that would have been such an amazing opportunity for the world to have a conversation about neurodiversity, changes in consciousness, the fact that there isn't only one way to be a conscious human being, an intelligent human being, a competent human being. Whatever your views about whether or not I don't really know anything about his specific cases, but you can be changed and different, and yet capable of work, capable of leadership, and that seems to me a very simple case where we should be able to hold both sides of that in a public space. But I haven't heard anybody say that. I haven't heard anybody say it. It's either yes or no, black or white.
Exactly. I think, and that speaks to this style and habits, and that I think it's Simone de Beauvoir who talks about being kind of railroaded into things and you don't even know you're on the railroad or whatever.
Yeah.
And I guess what I feel in your book and what I feel in a lot of really good philosophy is that there's a practice to it. There is a performance to it that, as you talk about a bit, you almost show us or teach us the patterns of a different way of kind of, moving, right? Moving in thought, but also in body. I mean, it's because those aren't separate. And I feel like we need that now on many different scales. Like it's an important, the making and the theory actually scale up to these levels like what you're discussing right now. We are, I mean, I'm getting to my own stuff, I guess, but I do feel like we're stuck in a way where we think a paradox means you choose between different one or the other, instead of like what you just described, opening the space, holding the paradox is what I say, because then you see the richness of, oh, it could be like this, or it could be like this, or I'm this person in this situation and this person in another. And as you talked about at the beginning, that's very hard to be alive in that way. It's a hard thing, it's work, but we need ways to do it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I completely am with you on that. And it goes to thinking about rationality. I think people think there's just one way to be rational. But on that one way of being rational, there's the evidence, there's the rules of logic, and there's what follows. And either you're right or you're wrong. But what's interesting is that in so many domains of human life, right and wrong are meaningless terms. If you and I, or they're not meaningless terms, but they're intrinsically disputable terms. That's the point. So, I might think, no, it's wrong to do that. And you might say, no, it's not wrong to do that. And neither of us is thinking, both of us are committed to the idea that there's a difference between right and wrong. But we realize that it's fraught. It's a site of conflict. It's potentially disputable. And to me, that's the very hallmark of the aesthetic, which, by the way, two philosophers who I think really brilliantly understood this. The first was Kant, who in the Third Critique says that the interesting thing about the aesthetic is that there are no rules, there's no proofs, I can't prove to you that something is beautiful. Either it is or it isn't for you, right? Either you experience its beauty or you don't. But beauty is not merely subjective, or questions of aesthetic aren't merely subjective. They're both intersubjectively significant. It's not just beautiful for me or beautiful for you. We can argue there's something for us to fight about there. And yet there's no independent decision procedure for deciding. And that's also, I think, although I think some people wouldn't agree with me, I think something like that is true throughout our lives. It's true in ethics, it's true in politics, and it's true in relationships, and it's true all over the place. And we need a new conception of reason that lets us encompass that.
I agree, and that touches on something you discuss in different books too, of not thinking of reason as a choice you make over emotion or instead of emotion or instead of feeling. In the same way, those aren't either or either, and and as you were talking, I was thinking, if two people are walking to the same place or up a mountain from different paths, then we could fight about whether we should go right or left, but it makes no sense because we're on different paths, but we might still get to the same place even if we go different directions. But we don't have a way of talking about that, thinking about that yet. But I think what you're doing and the kind of philosophy that you've been working on for all this time opens that up, because, perceiving is a way of acting and acting is a way of perceiving. And it's a way of holding the paradox for me of what all this stuff we've been talking about. So I just want to say thanks for doing it. And I'm glad you read those books when you were a kid and started on your lucky path.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for being so so interested and curious, and through your interest and curiosity, very inspiring to me. There's nothing, I'm sure you know this in your own creative work, that there's nothing that feeds you more than the sense that you're in relationship with someone else. So thank you.